then there is a lot of other work that start. Yeah, it's early in the morning, but this is my second meeting already
I
in the
can,
morning. Yeah.
I can imagine. I can imagine. So my colleague Salim
Yeah, we can
would
start,
start.
Nihal. I think it's already time. So let me welcome, of course, Hans Timmer and Dr. Nihal Pitigala, and of course, all the participants here today on this webinar on coping with energy and food prices. And our keynote speaker today is Dr. Hans Timmer, Chief Economist, World Bank and South Asia region. And this event will be moderated by Dr. Nihal Pitigala. He's the lead economist at WBD, and he was also an ex-economist at the World Bank, and he's an expert on international trade and regional integration. And he has worked quite a lot in different parts of the world, and especially on South Asia. So this is a part of this capacity building program in the BIMSTEC region. And both Nihal and I, we have been associated with this capacity building program, and many of the participants today are actually part of this program. So I welcome you all to this very important webinar, because these food and energy prices, they are extremely important, and the kind of crisis which we are witnessing all over the world, and especially implications for the BIMSTEC region, I think will be very, very relevant to analyze, and we really look forward to hear from Dr. Hans Timmer on this. So over to you, Dr. Nihal Pitigala, to moderate the session and also to introduce Dr. Hans Timmer with his short bio. And then I think we'll have a very fruitful discussion throughout the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim, my partner in crime. Good evening, everybody, and a very good morning from me and Hans. Thanks for turning up what I consider, as Salim said, a very consequential issue of our time, which is the food and energy crisis. Today, obviously, we have a very distinguished speaker, Hans. I had the great pleasure of introducing. So he's the Chief Economist of the South Asia region of the World Bank, who will touch upon how to cope with these twin crises. Now, this seminar is a part of a series we have introduced on ongoing USAID SANIT collaboration on the trade capacity building series. And it is fair to say that South Asia, there are a lot of interesting words used at a very distressing point, mostly because of the systemic changes taking place globally and partially due to its own making, I would say. The most decisive among is the mounting inflation, as Salim mentioned, due to food and energy crisis. The most South Asian countries are at least net energy importers, and may also have, they also import agriculture products, and it has elevated commodity prices have led to increased shortages, worsening of food insecurity in the region. High energy prices also have marked impact on the prices of other goods, such as food and fertilizer and non-energy goods, that then become entrenched over time and harder to contain. Who better to talk about this than Hans? Hans, very briefly, is assumed the chief economist position January 1st in 2019. Before that, he was a chief economist of the Europe and Central Asia region at the World Bank under the management of each year, a series of regional reports, most recently titled Towards a New Social Contract, and another one titled Critical Connections, and a series of regional economic updates produced. Prior to this position, Mr. Timmer was director of the World Bank's Development Prospects Group. And if interesting background, Hans, which I was very familiar, he's a quantitative international macroeconomist and an econometrician for over 30 years, with a management experience leading teams and modelers and forecasters and policy analysts. This is your domain, Salim. His experience ranges from long-term structural analysis and economic impact of environment policies, trade policies, tax reforms, etc., etc. Without further ado, let me pass on to Hans. Hans, I would let you sort of determine whether you want participants to interrupt you or whether you wish to finish your presentation and then entertain Q&A. So over to you, Hans. Been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's really my pleasure to be part of this seminar. the key word in the introductions was fruitful discussions. Indeed, I'm looking forward to fruitful discussions. And that means that although I have prepared some slides, I can give a presentation. It is great if there's immediate interaction also, and steer me in any direction that you want. Let me try now to share my screen.
Yeah, we see them.
Oh, yes. You can see the presentation?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, maybe
Yes.
in PowerPoint mode we
Point.
need to be seen.
Yeah, so I'm having it now on my whole screen in presentation mode. You are seeing something else?
We are seeing 6 slides altogether.
Ah, no, that's not how it should be. So then I don't know.
Then you go to, I think, presentation mode.
Yeah, which I did, and I see it on my screen in presentation mode, only one slide.
There you are. Oh,
yeah,
we just saw one slide. And
Hans, can you click on the second last icon at the bottom in the display? Second last on the
apps.
In the
I don't know.
It is okay. How else could we do this? At
Zoom
the top,
into the slide.
If you go to the top, you see autosave at the very top, Hans, and if you scroll along the way to the right, there is a podium that you can click on. That's to make it on a presentation mode. That will bring up a single slide. If you go to the very top, you see in your screen autosave off. Oh, I see your full screen back.
Apologies, with all my years of experience, okay. This is a challenge.
But we all go through it.
Very quickly, if you can just email us, we can also do it for you, the presentation. Your screen is now shown. I think you have shared your screen.
I shared my screen.
Yeah, full screen. So, it's not the PowerPoint, but your desktop and everything is in now. Yeah.
So
now,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, let me
tell. So if I go now through presentation mode, but then I have to get rid of the.
Hans, if you see on your screen at the very top, you see save. You see in the bar on the left corner, save, auto save is off, and then you get the disk sign to save the document.
Yeah.
And two sections from there, you see this podium. There, you click on that. Yeah.
Does that work?
I think this should work. So
I think they should do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This should.
This is great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Right.
Apologies.
No worries. No worries.
Okay, so the first slide is the cover of our latest South Asia economic focus, which had the title Coping with Shocks. And it discussed shocks much broader than just the rise in commodity prices, because the region has been hit in short order by what we used to say are once-in-a-lifetime shocks. So first of all, obviously, There is the war in Ukraine that has led to the sharp rises in energy prices and in food prices, but there was also the devastating floods in Pakistan. Also, what we would consider once in a lifetime disaster. Then you have the full-blown macroeconomic and balance of payment crisis in Sri Lanka. The country in South Asia that defaulted for the first time ever on its debt. There was no other country in history of South Asia that defaulted, and that all comes on top of the unprecedented COVID pandemic. So there are lots of shocks coming to South Asia, and what we observed is that the countries were not prepared to deal with these shocks, and the people, and especially the poorer people, were not prepared to deal with these shocks. And in that report, we focus on how to cope with these shocks. We present also our latest forecast, analysis of recent developments, and we have a chapter, as is shown here in the subtitle, on migration. How did migration do after the COVID pandemic? Are there scarring impacts? And we look at the role of migration as a coping mechanism against shocks, whether they are just economic shocks or environmental shocks. That's just the slide, just to whet your appetite for our latest product, but I will use some of the slides that are related to commodity prices in this presentation. And before I go to these slides, let's just have a brief discussion about the special characteristics of commodities. Commodities are obviously very normal goods. They are often bulk goods, very similar. They are substitutable. There's only one price for oil. There's one price for wheat in global markets. But from an economic point of view, they are very special, and that makes it also difficult to deal with changes in these commodity markets. So one first characteristic is that both on the demand side and on the supply side, the price elasticity of shocks is very, very low. That means that supply doesn't immediately adjust to a price signal. That is because on food, for example, you have a harvest, and after the harvest, supply is fixed. The same is true on energy. And that's mainly because of OPEC policy. You have a fixed supply that doesn't immediately adjust to price signals. And on the demand side, the price elasticity is also very low. People don't eat immediately less when the food prices are going up, because you have to eat. And also on energy in the very short run, it's very difficult to substitute away. So also the short run price elasticity of the demand for fuel is very low. What does that mean if both on the demand and supply side price elasticities are low? That means that any change in the market will translate in large price swings. And these price swings then can translate into overall inflationary spirals. And that's what we are seeing at the moment, sharp increases in the the prices of commodities because of the disruptions that were caused by the war in Ukraine, and these large price swings, they potentially trigger also other prices to increase, and you have an inflationary spiral. That is normally what you always see in an economic downturn or an upswing. You see that on the commodity side, the prices are going sharply up when you have a revival of an economy. In a downturn, you see these prices going down. Very different from what is happening with manufactured products, with more luxury products. That's where the volumes adjust and the prices are relatively stable. What does it also mean that the price elasticity is low? That means that people tend to continue to consume the energy and the food even when prices are going up. That means they tend to spend more in a current period, and if they cannot reduce spending on other items immediately, that means that they will have to dissave, they will have to borrow, and they hope then to be able to pay that back in the future when prices are very low. So you see an intertemporal smoothing over time of consumption. That is true for households, it is true for governments, but it is also true for countries as a whole. And as a result of that, we are seeing that the countries that are net importers of commodities, they are running larger current account deficits at the moment, and they will have to try to finance those deficits. So that's one characteristic of the commodity market. It's very important to understand that. Another characteristic of commodities, and especially of the cereals, the grains, the foods, is that the income elasticity is very low. That's an interesting phenomenon. The people don't eat a lot more when their incomes are going up. That means that over time, demand for grains is more or less growing with population in the world. It's not growing with income in the world. It also means that richer countries, they spend a smaller part of their income on these commodities than poorer countries, which means that when you have a sudden rise in commodity prices, poor countries are more vulnerable because it's a more important part of their income. And also, when you look within a country, the share that poor households, the share of their budget of poor households is much larger that they spend on these commodities, which means that also poor people are more vulnerable to a rise in these commodity prices. So that's to understand what is happening, what are the policy challenges, and what are the optimal policy responses. That's also important to realize on these commodities. And then finally, as a side, there is a strong correlation. It was already said in the introduction. There is a strong correlation between energy prices and food prices, especially in the global markets. That's partly because food prices are influenced by the price of fertilizers, and fertilizers obviously is basically fossil fuels. That's one link. Another link is that the transportation costs for food are relatively high compared to the transportation cost of other products in terms of share of value added. And since the last 15 years, there's also a stronger link between energy prices and food prices because of the use of of grains for biofuels, which means that biofuels become a substitute for fossil fuels, and that means that the correlation between these prices have become stronger also. So with that characteristic of these commodity markets, the recent sharp rise in commodity prices has created major challenges for the net commodity importers, and almost all countries in South Asia are net importers of food and energy imports. All countries are net importers of fossil fuels. Most countries are net importers of food also. What does that mean? When the price is increasing of the products that you are importing, that means, first of all, for the country as a whole, it is a terms of trade loss. Even when you are able to continue to produce the same as you used to do, the amount that you can consume, which is partly the imported commodities, the amount that you can consume with your income is much less. That means you have become poorer even if you produce the same. That is important to realize. You cannot hide from that. You cannot try to wish it away. Something will have to give after your input prices have gone up. A country is poor, and somebody has to pay the price for that. Often you see that governments are trying to protect people from becoming poor by subsidizing commodity prices, or by in other ways providing income support or relief efforts. But then that results in fiscal challenges, because somebody will have to pay that price, that the country as a whole has become poorer. Then also what especially when you look at energy commodities, what you see is that it can result in a negative supply shock. When suddenly the prices of energy are going up, then some industries are no longer viable. The costs are just too high. And so that means that your production capacity is shrinking. You see that also when you can't afford the import of fertilizers anymore. That means that your productivity in agriculture is coming down. And so a rise in commodity prices can lead also to a negative supply shock, so that you produce less than you used to do. And so these two things together means that there is a sharp income loss. So that's one big challenge that the countries in South Asia are dealing with now. And then I mentioned it already in the previous slide. There is a tendency when commodity prices are going up to continue to spend and pay a higher price for these commodities, to spend on the same amount of commodities. That means that you spend more than your income. That is true for households, it's true for governments, but it's also true for countries. And that means that you create a balance of payment deficit, or your balance of payment deficit that was already there will be larger. And what I meant was a current account deficit. The current account deficit will be larger, and that leads to balance of payment tensions, because you have to find a way to finance that current account deficit. And optimally, what you would do in a situation like that is to increase interest rates and to have a real depreciation. That is the standard adjustment mechanism when you suddenly have a larger current account deficit. But that in itself leads also to problems because the nominal depreciation can lead to additional inflation, and many countries therefore resist the nominal depreciation, but they can only do that by eroding their reserves, and that leads then to additional balance of payment tensions. So these are the big challenges that the countries are facing as a result of that rise in commodity prices. Now, then a couple of slides that I took from that latest South Asia economic focus. Probably I won't be able now to explain all the details in these graphs, but that's to some extent good, because that might be an incentive for you to look at the report where there is a lot more detail. But what you're seeing here is for three countries, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, the price increase of a series of very specific products in their economies, ranked with the product that had lowest price increase to the products that had highest price increase. And the energy products are shown in red. The food products are shown in blue, and then you have other products also. So a first observation is that the rise in prices, which is experienced as overall inflation, is really concentrated in the food prices and the energy prices. But over time, and you see the increase in prices in an earlier period illustrated by dots in the graph. Over time, you see that the price increases are spreading to other products also, and that increasingly it is also the non-oil and non-food products that are showing price increases. That is partly because these other products, they use energy as input. And so at some point, these costs are transferred to the consumers with higher prices also. But there is the danger that overall input prices are rising, including wages, because everybody wants to get compensated for these prices, which means that there is the danger that this large relative price change triggers an overall inflation. And that is then self-reinforcing, because if all other products and if all wages are increasing, but there is this shortage in the food markets and in the energy markets, the prices of food and energy will rise even further because they want to force a relative price change. And so that's the situation that we are in now, where we are very closely monitoring what is happening with overall inflation. But it is no longer just a relative price shock. It is a macroeconomic phenomenon. Then one illustration of the impact of higher commodity prices on the balance of payments and on the current account. What this graph shows is looking at 8 products, fuels, some food products, and fertilizers, is how much your trade balances and as a result also your current account balances would deteriorate if you continue to consume the same volume of these products, but you have to pay the higher prices now. And we are looking at a period that of 1 year that ended in May 2022. And that was exactly the period of the largest increase in these commodity prices. And actually, the numbers shown in these graphs are pretty striking, because it means that on average, the countries in South Asia will have to pay 5% of their GDP more if they want to consume the same amount of these products. And that is what they are willing to do, because the price elasticity of demand of these products for these products is so low. And so if nothing else changes, then the current account will deteriorate by 5% of GDP. That creates huge macroeconomic problems, because that is not easily financed. And that means you need adjustment mechanism through which either the imports of these products in volume terms is being reduced, or you need a change in relative prices, as a result of which these countries can export more or reduce more of their imports of luxury goods. This graph also shows what we call the terms of trade losses as percent of GDP. That is how we calculate terms of trade losses, how much less you can spend, even if you produce the same amount, even if GDP is not changed, how much less can you consume. And that means that on average, in that year, the countries were suddenly 5% poorer, just because of these commodity prices. When we look at how countries are doing, we always look at GDP numbers, but in this case, that's ultimately not that relevant, because GDP is only a reflection of production. It is not a reflection of how much you can consume. And in terms of income, the situation in South Asia was much more dire than when you look at the GDP numbers. So I already mentioned you have these balance of payment shocks. You need adjustments, and these adjustments indeed did come. There were depreciations of the currencies in several countries. In some cases, large depreciations. That is a normal adjustment. If that doesn't completely is nullified by domestic inflation, that would lead also to a real depreciation. That is ultimately what you need to be able to bring equilibrium again on the balance of payments. But not all countries want to see the sharp depreciation happening. They try to fight that, and they use the reserves. If you have large reserves, it's only a temporary price shock. That makes a lot of sense. Then you use your reserves as a buffer. But if these prices remain at a high level, then that is unsustainable. And many countries saw their reserves declining to dangerous levels, which then increased further the tensions on the balance of payments. An example was Bangladesh, that tried to prevent the depreciation that came from the markets for a long time. But in the middle of the year, the reserves had come down so much that they had to let the currency depreciate, and while doing that, they ended up with a system of multiple exchange rate, because they didn't want that depreciation to be felt by everybody in the economy. That in itself created all kinds of problems also. So the point is that this is not just a theory that the balance of payment tensions will lead to adjustments, but it was actually happening. And then that depreciation in itself, I said, that leads then to additional inflation, hopefully not to completely nullify the nominal depreciation, but it is an additional challenge. It leads to political problems also. So let me then go back to the first two slides where I talked about the specific characteristics of commodity markets, and where I talked about how that leads to very specific macroeconomic challenges. But then use those slides to start talking about what are the optimal policy responses to shocks in commodity markets. So if you have a low price elasticity of demand and supply, which means that a very small shock in the market can really trigger large price increases with all the consequences that are undesirable. What does that mean for policies? The first obvious response or obvious condition that would mitigate this characteristic of the market is to build buffers in those markets, buffers for food, buffers for energy, because then when there is a shock, then you can use these buffers to mitigate, for example, a decline in the flow of supply, and you don't trigger then these very large price elasticities. And many countries have done that. There are large buffers of food in India, for example, and other countries they have built strategic oil reserves. Those are good policies to mitigate the large price swings that are characteristics for the commodity markets. It is also a good strategy to diversify demand and supply so that you have more substitutes, which means that it is easier to absorb these shocks, because then you can move both on the supply side and on the demand side to other products outside of these commodity markets that are affected. And so one way to do that is to open up more trade. For example, trade in food is a very good way to absorb swings in food prices, especially when the shock is domestic. And normally many of the food price shocks are caused by domestic crop failure, for example. If you have a closed economy, that will lead to large price increases of the products that are in shorter supply now. If you have a trading system, then you can supplement that supply by imported goods. So more trade is obviously a way to mitigate these prices. Unfortunately, what you're seeing at the moment is the opposite, that you see all kinds of trade restrictions on these commodities. And in my last slides, I will come back to that. But also, you can think of other products on the demand side where you have substitute for specific foods, but introducing other diets in a country also can help mitigate the price swings. On the supply side, especially of energy, obviously it is good if there's an alternative in the form, for example, of renewable energy, because then again you have a way of mitigating the shock in the fossil fuel market. So that is linked to the low price elasticity of demand and supply. When you think about the low income elasticity of demand, which means that especially the poor people are hit very much, then the optimal response is to have really targeted support, income support for the poor, and perhaps in some cases also to broaden access to finance, where now a large share of the population in South Asia does not have that access to finance, but it would be helpful for many of them to have that access so that they can smooth their consumption over time. But the poorest of the poor, they need income support. That is the optimal solution. Unfortunately, the systems are not in place to go for that optimal solution. What you see is that in most cases, the policy reaction is a subsidy of the commodity prices to shield the people from the rise in these commodity prices. That is incredibly expensive because you're not only supporting the poor, but you are also supporting all those people that that don't need the support. It is expensive. It is also ineffective because you are not triggering the volume response to the higher prices that ultimately is needed in the market also. So then the policy discussion linked to that second slide in the beginning, and this is the last slide of my presentations. How do you deal with terms of trade laws, which means that as a country, you are suddenly poor? How do you deal with the fact that you have a negative supply shock potentially? And how do you deal with balance of payment tensions? So first of all, I already mentioned that when you have a terms of trade laws, you can't ignore it. You can't walk away from it. You can't act as if nothing happened. Somebody will have to pay the price. You cannot compensate everybody for that loss. Somewhere, ultimately, somebody will have less income, and that might ultimately be the government itself also. And then all these shocks, they translate into fiscal problems also. The same is true when you have a negative supply shock. You see disappointing numbers for production, for GDP, but that is not a result of lack of demand. It is a result because capacity is less now. And so what you should not do is to respond to every decline in GDP and every loss in income with fiscal stimulus, because you cannot compensate everybody. And when you have a negative supply shock like COVID, the COVID pandemic was also a negative supply shock. You cannot work your way out of a negative supply shock by stimulating demand. And the only thing that happens then is you create stagflation, you create inflation, while at the same time the growth numbers are disappointing. And that's exactly what happened in the high-income countries in the 1970s and the 1980s, when there was this very sharp rise in oil prices. The incomes declined. There was a balance of payment shock, and the growth was disappointing because there was a negative supply shock, and the governments reacted to that by fiscal stimulus, and they ended up with a lot of inflation without growth. It was a new phenomenon. It was called stagflation, and ultimately it required very harsh monetary policy to get out of that. We are in a similar situation. The shocks that we are observing are not demand shocks. They are different kind of shocks, and you need different policies, and especially you need an adjustment in relative prices so that you can export more and you reduce your imports of other products. And somebody is not muted, but I'm almost done here. And so how to react to balance of payment tensions only to a limited extent. You can fight the pressures that will come anyhow. The pressures will ultimately force countries for a real depreciation. And if you fight that, it only leads to depletion of reserves. And we have seen that in many countries. What we have seen also in many countries is instead of letting prices work, to have direct import restrictions, volume restrictions. That can be very inefficient also. We have seen the case of Sri Lanka when there was suddenly an import restriction on fertilizers, and that led immediately to a decline in productivity in agriculture. When you have these kind of restrictions, also it leads to a lot of opportunities for arbitrage. There's no a level playing field anymore. Some people get a permit to import, others not. The people who get that permit, often closely linked to the government, they can create a lot of benefits by selling the products at a higher price. One final word about these trade restrictions is about the export restrictions of food that we have seen in the region. In the report, we have a whole list of export restrictions. India, for example, has an export restriction on rice, an export restriction on wheat, with the idea that if you keep more of your food domestically, then you can prevent the rise in the prices of these foods, and you can prevent all the problems that I discussed that come from the increase in prices. But that also is very, very inefficient when you do that, because what happens when you prevent the export of these products, when you were previously a net exporter of these products, that will immediately increase the prices in international markets. It will make it more difficult for other countries to increase your food, to consume food, and you widen the gap between the international prices and the domestic prices. And when the producers in your own country, they see that gap between international prices and domestic prices, they don't have an incentive to supply to the domestic market, and they tend to wait. They tend to find other ways of exporting, and ultimately what you see is that those domestic prices are going are going slowly back to the international prices. So a lot of the trade restrictions, both on the import side and on the export side, have been very ineffective. That was actually my last slides, but I added 2 slides again from the the report. One is summarizing all the subsidies that are given in South Asia, which is very expensive and ineffective. And here we also have a slide of the cost of the export restrictions, the cost for other countries in terms of the amount of money they have to pay and the amount of nutrition that they can afford. That's the end of my presentation. It might be me, it might be that I didn't look at the chat, but I didn't hear a lot of interruptions, but I'm looking very much forward to the discussion. It's indeed, as you said in the beginning, a tough topic for South Asia at the moment, for the countries, for the people in the countries, and it comes on top of all these other shocks that the region is dealing with. Over to you, Nihal.
Nihal, you have to unmute.
Thanks, Hans. That's an excellent, comprehensive, and a very cohesive roundup of what some of the major tenets and issues, both on the transmission mechanism, the currency, and the trade policy to end it. In the interest of time, and I wanted to sort of bring up some of the questions that is already posted on the thread. And I will also encourage the rest of them to sort of, after these questions are addressed, to raise their hands up and directly ask hands. And one of the questions that initially posted by is Nahid Sata, where he says, how can the difference in inflation for public transportation costs among the three countries can be explained? For the he refers to a slide that he presented. That is the first question. And the second one that's posted is, I can go back if you like, but the depreciation as a correction method for current account deficit implicitly assumes that exports will rise with the depreciation. In most cases, this doesn't happen. Then doesn't depreciation lead to deterioration of the current account balance? That was the second question. And last question, good evening. This is from Saga Junkaki. Good evening, everyone. My question, what fiscal and monetary policy measures should the South Asian nations like Nepal take to counter the growing inflation and BOP deficit? And how are intergovernmental organizations helping the least developing countries to mitigate? I think that's a related start, to mitigate the negative effects of US dollar value increase. Over to you, Hans. Some quick questions, and then we'll see what else that springs up.
Thanks very much. So first on the different price increases in public transportation, I'm not sure I can give you the final answer now off the cuff, and I would have to look more into detail. But one obvious reason is that not all countries subsidize public transportation in the same way. And so when in some countries there is cost recovery in public transportation, then you will see that increase in fuel prices will increase also public transportation. In other countries where there is more political price setting of public transportation, then you see that the costs are not being recovered. And that's important to realize that because when we talk about subsidies, it's not just the direct subsidies that the consumers are seeing in terms of subsidies for fuel or subsidies for electricity or subsidies for specific food products, but it's often indirect also for other services, often produced public services by state-owned enterprises, and implicitly in these cases there are subsidies also, which generates then its own problems because these state-owned enterprises start having losses, and those are guaranteed by the government. So it's all going back to that same phenomena. A country is poorer, you can't hide from it. Somewhere it will show up, and so then whether depreciation will lead immediately to more exports. Not always immediately, but don't underestimate the mechanism that price competitiveness still works in global markets. And often what you see in the reaction when you talk about adjustment mechanism is that people look at the current situation where not only commodity prices are going up, but where the global growth is slowing and imports from high-income countries are slowing, and then people see, I don't see my exports growing, but the counterfactual might still be that you are exporting more when you are more competitive in your prices than when not. So that is one point. And also, even if it doesn't happen immediately, then it can happen next year and the following year, and ultimately you are in better shape of your balance of payments. So that's one observation. The second observation is that depreciation not only leads to more exports, it also leads to less imports. And it makes especially luxury goods more expensive for the population in a country, which means that they start reducing their imports, because those are the goods where the price elasticity of demand is large, unlike the commodities. And that is a better way of reducing those imports than just having arbitrary restrictions for a couple of months. Now you cannot import a car, or now you cannot import something else. So ultimately this works. And then more importantly, when you have a disequilibrium in a market, like on the balance of payments, you cannot avoid these kind of depreciations. It will happen anyhow. Whether you think it is effective or not, the market will force you. And if you try to fight it, then ultimately you will see that the market is stronger because you have run out of reserves. Then the next question was about fiscal and monetary policy responses. Normally, in this kind of situation, it is important to focus your fiscal expenditure on helping the poor, have very targeted support efforts, but don't respond to a decline overall of production or income with a fiscal stimulus. That is counterproductive. And so this is a time where actually you have to be very cautious on the fiscal side. You already have inflation in your country, and when you think you can solve the problem by just spending more as a government, you are not increasing your production, you are just increasing the inflation. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't spend, but do it in a very, very targeted and efficient and sensitive way. And for monetary policy, it is in general good to focus now on inflation, to keep inflation under control. But for Nepal, it is a different situation because Nepal has the exchange rate linked to the Indian rupee. And there are all kinds of reasons not to have it pegged to the rupee, but there are also many, many reasons why it is actually a good policy to have it linked and pegged to the rupee. And so if you stay in the current system, then you cannot have at the same time an exchange rate target and an inflation target. And so then you should continue to focus on keeping the peg, but don't do that with reserves. Do that with interest rate policies. There was a question on international organizations. I think this is the time where in the very short run, all international organizations are trying to provide short-term relief, as for example we did in Sri Lanka, helping the country to import medicine, essential foods when you are in a full-blown crisis. This is the time where the IMF plays a role. because almost all countries, they have a balance of payment challenge now. Not only Pakistan and Sri Lanka, it's Bangladesh that came to the IMF also, and several of the smaller countries already had IMF programs. But this is also a time where you should rethink your long-term growth strategy, that you become less vulnerable, more resilient, not only to shocks in energy prices or food prices, but also more resilient to, for example, the environmental shocks that we expect will come more frequently than we have seen in the past. And so that is what we call the rebuilding better in a more more resilient way. And to do that, I personally am strongly convinced that that means also that it has to be more inclusive. One of the problems of most South Asian countries is that even if there was a lot of growth, that growth was concentrated in a small part, often the formal economy in those countries. 80% of the people are outside that, and you see that not only the countries were not ready to deal with the shocks, many people were not able to cope with the shocks just because their income levels are so low. And so a resilient strategy means also a more inclusive strategy, and that is what we are working on with countries. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Salim, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question and probably a small comment too. Thank you, Hans. It's an excellent presentation and very insightful. I have one difficult question for you and probably less difficult question. The most difficult question is, what do you think, what is the kind of projection at the World Bank? How long this crisis would continue? I think this is the most difficult question. But on the other side is that when you talked about building buffers for food and energy, and you emphasized quite a lot that how important it is during this crisis situation. But at the same time, you also mentioned how countries, they also impose restrictions on exporting food. Do you see the kind of contradiction in these two approaches, like, whether they can actually go along together? Because while building the buffers, countries, they may also opt for putting restrictions on exporting. So that is one thing. I think probably that is also would be very, very critical while we consider trade in food and energy, and especially trade in food among the South Asian countries. You talked about this targeted income support. This is definitely most desirable, but probably on the other side, when it comes to the implementation, is the most difficult part, because how do you target? And we know that given the kind of situation, especially very weak database, very kind of weak institutional context, the targeted becomes very wrongly targeted. So, should we actually, okay, we'll consider that this can be wrongly targeted, but we'll still go along with this targeted approach. My final question would be with respect to the energy policy, because you mentioned about the energy price and how the countries can be resilient and given this current crisis. But you, at the very end, also emphasized on these environmental issues. But what I fear, and looking at the recent response, not only from the South Asian countries, many European countries as well, especially the Russia-Ukraine war, and going back to the coal, going back to some of the very dirty energies, and some of the South Asian countries, they're also kind of, probably they may keep aside the environmental issues behind, and then because of this very urge or current need for solving the energy crisis. So what do you think, how do you really, how do these countries would solve this problem, whether this environmental issue would be actually a sidelined issue now for some time because of the current crisis? But thank you once again, Hans. It was very, very stimulating and thought-provoking.
Okay. I thought it was one question which I could remember, but then there were
Yeah.
4, I think. So I started writing. I hope I still have them. So I think you thought that the first question was the most difficult one. How long will this last? I think that's actually an easy question because there's an easy answer. I don't know. Um, but what I would say is that in general, increases in commodity prices can be temporary or long-lasting. And long-lasting doesn't mean forever, but for many years. And the policy response to these increases are different. When it's really temporary, you use buffers. You can even subsidize temporarily these prices because you don't want big adjustments, for example, because of high energy prices for a short run when after half a year these energy prices are down again. And so there are other ways to bridge that short period of high energy prices. When they last for a longer period, then you need structural adjustments. You have to adjust your economy to the new relative prices, and that goes back to all the things that I discussed. And for me, policymakers at this moment should treat these increases in prices as long-lasting prices. This is not something of a couple of months. Even if we don't know exactly where it ends, we have seen such major shifts in global markets. We are seeing geopolitical shifts where we don't know where that will end. And I think countries should be prepared that especially these energy prices will be high for a long period. This is not something that you can bridge. This is something that you adjust to. And that goes then back to your last point also, because that coincides with anyhow the need to move away from fossil fuels and to start building also a capacity in renewables. And so let me take then that last point also. There is indeed a danger that in the very short run, people are forgetting about the environment. They're only concerned about energy security, and that if that means using more coal, then they go for coal, and that goes against the environmental objectives. That's true, but I'm not that pessimistic. Because first of all, in the short run, you do see an adjustment on the demand side. When you look at Europe, you do see that demand for energy has actually declined significantly in Europe because of the high prices and because of large campaigns to be careful with energy use. And so that is an adjustment in the right direction for the environment. And I think the adjustment on the supply side towards coal will be only a short-term adjustment. But increasingly, you will see that countries will develop the opportunities for renewables because of the environment, because of air pollution, all the other objectives, but also because ultimately they see the macroeconomic danger of being dependent on fossil fuel imports. It has been really costly. And so I'm optimistic that even if we see in the short run a step towards coal, that this is an episode that both on the demand and supply side will lead to a greener economy. Then your question on building buffers, but at the same time saying, oh, but you shouldn't have export restrictions because How can you build buffers if everything goes into your exports? I probably find that the most difficult question, but my answer is, okay, when you think about food security, when you want to have the right policies in these food markets, start with free trade. That's the most important one. Because food security doesn't mean self-sufficiency. Countries that try to be self-sufficient will find themselves in episodes of bad harvest, where they are really struggling with providing enough food to their people, which would have been easily solved when they could have imported food in periods that they need, and when you realize that that is important to create food security, then it's also logical that in times that you have a surplus, that you export your food. And so most of the shocks in the food markets are domestic shocks. That's not what is happening at the moment. It's coming from global markets. But most of the shocks in the food markets are domestic shocks. And the way you protect yourself against this by having open trade relations. So that should always come first. But I don't think that that is inconsistent with, at the same time, building stocks. And you build stocks not at the moment that there is scarcity, not at the moment that you can only build stocks when you prevent exports, but you build stocks at times that prices are low. And then you use your stocks when these prices are very high. And there might be then some instances that you say, okay, now I'm using my stocks to relieve the market, but at the same time we are still exporting. There might be some political difficult discussions. That is what I think makes this question so difficult. But in general terms, I don't think it is inconsistent. In general terms, I think the two can go hand in hand. But if you have to choose for free trade, because it is very bad for the international markets if you have export restrictions. And I'm convinced, and there's a lot of evidence, that it backfires on your own country also. And even in terms of geopolitics, yeah, it is very strange to suddenly, in a time of need, to put these export restrictions in place. Think about the start of the pandemic, where everybody was in need of vaccines, and then you had the vaccine diplomacy, and India could be a very helpful and coordinating role for the region by making these vaccines available. And you shouldn't forget about that aspect also. So I will always err on the side of free trade in this case, not because free trade is always good, but I think in this case, when you talk about food markets, it's very effective. Then targeted support, it's so difficult. Again, let's not be too pessimistic. I think there has been made a lot of progress since the COVID pandemic. Yeah, with the help of new technologies, the digital technologies that got a boost during the COVID pandemic. Also, we have seen a large expansion, broadening of the social protection systems in India, in Pakistan, in a way, with the help of digital technologies that can be very, very targeted and a lot more efficient than just subsidizing prices for everyone. So let's not be too pessimistic. There is progress in this area, and that progress should be supported. Having said that, I strongly feel that to help poor households cope with these kind of shocks, social protection systems are not enough.
Mm.
Ultimately, what is needed is that these poor households get better opportunities to earn more income. And I'm convinced there is a lot of underutilized capacity in all South Asian countries of all those people that are in the informal sector, that don't have access to finance, don't have access to markets, find it difficult to use technologies, and there are a lot of examples that you can have interventions that increases productivity and unleash that potential. And if you are not doing that, if still 80%, sometimes 90% of the people are hardly earning an income, you cannot solve that continuously with social protection. You have to solve that with creating better jobs. And then you have the fact that female labor force participation in South Asia is only 20%, perhaps up to 25%, but 20% and declining in India, 20% in Pakistan. Huge underutilized potential. And so if you're not working on that, if your growth strategy is not focusing on these elements, then you always have a struggle to prepare your people to cope with all these shocks. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Excellent question. Great responses, Hans. Nahidi, before I come to you, let me ask if there's anyone else has any questions for Hans, as we are almost drawing closer to our time. Anyone else from Sri Lanka?
Just to add one thing, someone asked about the links for the report. Probably, definitely these reports are available online. So from Sanem, we'll be sharing with you the link to the report. Yeah, thank you, participants.
Thank you so much, Salim.
Yeah, anybody else?
And I will share also the PowerPoint that I showed, Salim.
That will be helpful. Yes. Okay, go ahead, Nahid. Since nobody is raising its hand, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Dr. Hans Timmer, for the presentation you made. So I just wanted to talk about two things. So one is, again, I would like to ask again a bit about the buffer, the food buffer you have talked about. So my first question in this regard is exactly what do we mean by a food buffer in this regard? Is it more like a public, like a food buffer or a storage or a stock system that we think that should be developed? And if that is the case, then do you think, say, like a country like Bangladesh, I'm not really aware about the situation in our other neighboring countries, has a mechanism or a capacity to do this effectively? Of course, we know that there is a public procurement system for rice in Bangladesh, and there are a lot of issues with that. I don't think many of our developing partners actually like the way that operates, and of course there are some criticisms in the way that operates. So actually, do we have a mechanism right now of building a food buffer in an effective way? So that is my one question. The other is about, like, of course, you are talking about the free trade argument in favor of the free trade argument that would probably lessen the crisis, the food crisis, or among the countries. But say, as any individual country, like, can we really trust the other countries to really behave in the way that would help in not making any country fall into a crisis? So given the geopolitical complexity that is growing over time. So if I'm an individual country, so I say during 2007 and 8 crisis, we saw that a lot of countries were banning exports, and a country like Bangladesh was really suffering to get rice from anywhere. So is there any mechanism or any assurance that we can see that that would not happen again, or we could avert that situation? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Also, two difficult questions for me. The first one is difficult because I'm not an agricultural specialist, and so I shouldn't say too much about this. But when you talk about the useful role of food buffers, and you think especially about grains then that can be stored for a long time, then first of all, you need storage capacity. And because of the important role of buffers, I can see a role of the government there to support the investment in storage capacity, or even to invest as government in storage capacity. That is one role for the government. The other one is that then if you play an important role in buying and selling and storing food as government, you have to be very careful in how you manipulate the market, because as I heard from you also, it can quickly lead to distortions, to creating not a level playing field. You can have favorite dealings that you are supporting, and so that means that you need a very clear system of rules on how these buffers are being released, when they are being released, and when they are being replenished. So that is all not easy. It is tricky, but I do think buffers historically in other countries have played a very useful and important role in commodity markets, and so that means that if you don't have it, then it's something to think about it. And once you have it, you have to think very deeply about exactly then what the role of the government is in the market, and how you can maintain a level playing field, and how you can maintain transparency. That's not a very satisfying answer, and you would have to talk more to agricultural specialists who have a lot of experience in this.
Okay.
Your second point on free trade is very, very important, and one of the frustrating things for me is that the WTO already for a long time not very successful in creating new deals. When there was the old deal, then agriculture was actually the exemption. That for agriculture, countries could make an exception, while in my view, exactly for agriculture, and because food security is such an important issue, that's where we need commitments, precisely because countries will need to trust each other on this one. And so we are pushing hard, and I think everybody should do that. As an economist, it is important to continue to make that case that everybody is better off with a trading system, and that food security is much less in a closed economy, and ultimately that these export bans that seem logical in the short run actually backfires even to your own country also. But very, very important point.
Okay, Hans. Inderjit, I don't know whether you have a question. I have a quick follow-up from Hans. Obviously, the most telling message coming from you is that this price hikes, the inflation is entrenched. It shouldn't be treated as transitory. In that vein, do you think the explanation, if you look at from the long run perspective, apparently the oil prices and the exchange rate fluctuations explains most of it. Do you think it's just the oil price that might probably be the primary reason that it might be entrenched? Because there's different pass-throughs from the international prices to the domestic, and those pass-throughs differ from country to country and to commodity to commodity. So how do you see?
Now, if inflation, if entrenched, and that's still an if for me.
Okay.
So if we start now a long period of high inflation, it is not because of the oil prices.
Okay.
Because oil prices have increased a lot. They are at a high level. They might remain at a high level. That was a relative price change, but they will not continue to increase. And so that will not be the factor that will continue year after year to increase all prices. And the reason why inflation might become entrenched is because not only there is a pass-through of commodity prices ultimately into all other prices, but because other factors of production and especially the wages will start increasing also.
Yeah.
And then you have a wage increase and then a price increase, and then you want to compensate the wages again, so you have the wage price spiral.
Yeah.
And that's what you try to avoid in two ways: by having monetary policy that focuses on inflation, but also by taking seriously the point that I made, that when there is an income loss of a country, not everybody can be compensated. It's just not possible. It doesn't work that way. And still, in determining the wages of civil servants, because in South Asia, that's mainly the mechanism, we think that we can do that. When consumer prices are going up, then the wages have to be compensated. But it was a relative price change as a result of which everybody became poorer. You can't compensate everybody. And if you do that, then you have a wage price spiral, because then these markets say, oh, my prices have to go up even further relative to all the other prices. And then the wages go again. So that is really the danger at the moment, which then can be fueled also by the fact that sometimes governments will react to negative developments by just fiscal stimulus, which leads again to more inflation. That danger is not that big at the moment because of the fiscal constraints, but that's ultimately what the danger is. And you try to avoid that, and you try to hope that this remains a relative price shock. But there is a danger. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely, Ken. I think the pervasiveness of the trade policy, using bans, is certainly something I think immediately South Asia can look at, something within their purview. I think that's that a lot of attention has to be paid to. Indrajit, please go ahead. Over to you.
No, thank you, Nihal. As you asked me, let me just pop one question. Sadly, I missed the first part of Hans's presentation because I had another commitment. But what I was going to ask Hans was, he was saying that now that the bank is working very hard to tackle agricultural subsidies, now I think I've seen that the bank, the fund, and the WTO are working increasingly closely on a number of multilateral trade issues, I think including the agricultural subsidies. But are these highly distortionary subsidies in developed countries? Are there any signs that the argument is changing, at least their positions are changing? Or is it that under the current set of circumstances with the possible recession, particularly in Europe, and also insecurity on the energy front, that we're not going to make any progress on agricultural subsidies for quite some time still?
Thanks for joining, Inderjeet. Nice
Hi,
to have you
Hans.
in the meeting. I think I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic, and wherever I see some progress, I try to build on that. And even if it is difficult politically in countries to reduce those subsidies, it is important to keep pushing, because there are so much more efficient way of supporting the people who really need the support. As you said, internationally, we are discussing it also. I think internationally, the subsidies are not even the highest priority. I think the trade restrictions are even more important to address at a coordinated international level. I think one bit of a perverse hope I have is that because of the current fiscal constraints in many developing countries, and especially in South Asia, linked to balance of payment constraints, makes it more and more difficult to spend so much of your budget on these kind of subsidies, that just from a pure budget perspective, governments start looking at alternatives. And what we have seen in the region, not so much on the food side, but on the energy side, is that more and more countries are moving away from direct energy subsidies, and they are looking at other ways. But I always realize in these discussions that as an economist, it is so much easier to look at these issues because you see what is optimal, while as a politician, it is so much more difficult because food prices, energy prices are so important for consumers. But yeah, so I see your point that I shouldn't oversell this, but it is so important that I continue to push, and I think we all should continue to push.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Anyone else? Any thoughts, any afterthoughts? All right, we have almost approached the hour and a half time mark. Hans, this has been, I'm sure this is a topic that we can go on for another hour or so, given time. But I think given your commitments, we really appreciate you turning up for this very important, very decisive topics, the crisis to address. And we hope to stay in touch with you. And I'm sure there will be afterthoughts from your presentation. Some of the colleagues will reach out to us. Hopefully we can pass that over to Khalid if we do get it. And I hope to stay in touch with you, and we'll certainly circulate the report. That will be very important, and that will be excellent read. I recommend everybody to read that. Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Salim, and thank you everybody for participating. Until next time. See you. Good morning.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you,
everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Salim.
Bye, Indrajit. Bye.
Bye everybody. Yeah. Bye, Salim.